ultimately, if you're designing a game that is catering to the most competitive players, you are self-limiting your audience from the jump.
Distraction makers.
This is our third video in the Artifact series. This is going to be sort of a wrap-up. And I think one thing that really comes to mind for me when I think about the reasons why this game didn't work is when I have to ask the question of who is this game for?
Yeah.
And, you know, Valve coming out of the gate with, you know, $1 million tournament, very clearly focused on trying to make this an esport. I don't know if that was Richard Garfield's intention. I'm assuming that Scaphalias, someone who works with Richard Garfield a lot.
They wrote Characteristics of Games
They
together.
wrote Characteristics of
with
Games together.
A third person I can't remember the name of.
Yeah, they also have a consulting company called Three Donkeys. That's their like main thing they do now. But Scaphalias is responsible for championing organized play at Magic. He helped create the ELO system that Magic used and organized competitive play.
Yep.
And with him being so tied, you know, to Richard Garfield, I assume that he had some kind of input in this situation too. I don't know if they were both brought on as consultants or if it was just Richard.
Yeah, Scaff was there.
Scaff was there too?
Yeah.
Okay. So with that in mind, clearly there is experts in the field of competitive card games. So I think that out of the gate, the intention is for this game to be the highest level of competitive card games.
I think Valve has, explicitly said they really wanted it to be that. They wanted it to be highly competitive.
Right. And when you, I think in terms of, you know, Richard and Scaphalias, their expertise in thinking about, they know, you know, or at least have this design philosophy of that skill and luck are not dynamically opposed. They have a relationship, but luck basically just reduces the returns that you get from skill. It doesn't actually reduce the amount of skill that is required to play that the game has.
Right.
And with that perspective coming into this, I don't think that perspective is shared by competitive gamers.
No, I think most players actually, it's a very unintuitive idea of seeing luck, which is why I think so many people end up getting it mixed up. It's something that you really have to get in the nuts and bolts of game design before you start seeing those different moving parts in that way.
Right, and usually the example that gets brought up here is that poker is a very good example of a game that is very high luck and high skill.
Yeah.
And
so is Artifact. What do you know?
So is Artifact. And I think that like players who play poker sort of accept this fact, but when you get when a new game shows up, some of the first inclinations of very competitive players is to look at any kind of output randomness, any kind of randomness at all, really, as being a detractor from their return to skill. Right.
I mean,
the
they
gains
want to,
that they get from their skill.
They want to optimize the game and reduce the luck as much as possible in order to see the most consistent output of their skill, of their actions.
Right. And I think that, you know, in so many ways, Magic has skills or has variance that is impactful to competitive play and important to competitive play. But I do wonder if in some ways, with them being so early on in terms of competitive card games, the first card game, that they sort of were grandfathered in some of this variance in that they sort of spearheaded organized play in general. And at the beginning of the game, competitive play wasn't at the forefront of their minds, right? It sort of came afterward when a big enough audience for this game grew, and they're like, well, we love playing this competitively, and we want to follow that line as far as it goes. But initially, like, I don't know if you can start there. I don't know if you can say the card game is meant to be an esport,
right? And
that's what it is from the beginning.
And I think Richard has even commented on this in some of his interviews for talking about Artifact, where he's mentioned that like the the unique like quality that some games end up finding of having this cross section between players that are interested in the competitive level and a casual player base that's interested on just playing it as like a game, as a casual game, is something that is so difficult and is not something that you can always plan for. And right, if you go into it with that mindset, and you see plenty of games that have done this, you see tons of games. I mean, look at how many games wanted to be like Overwatch or wanted to be like League or whatever. After any of those games started making it big, everyone started seeing how well the companies are doing, how big the tournaments are. How many other studios or how many other companies were like, well, we want to make that. And then they make it, and then the game flops and they shut it down after a few months.
What
like,
I think
happens all the time.
Yeah, and I think looking at like the ecosystem of a game is so important here, especially card games, right? Where you sort of you need a big enough player base that just enjoys playing the game to sort of get the most competitive players to bubble to the surface, right? You can't just focus on the top of that peak and say, okay, this is the people that are going to play our game, because like that's a handful of people. Like, you know what I mean? Like ultimately, if you're designing a game that is catering to the most competitive players, you are self-limiting your audience from the jump. And like, you know, Valve has an infinite money printer, so maybe they were fine with that being the case and that the audience for this was never going to be, you know, insane. I assume that they did not want, they wanted a giant audience for this game. But, you know, maybe that was a risk that they were willing to take. But then on the flip side of that, it's weird then to charge $20 for the game and then also have microtransactions. So like, to me, there's this amorphousness to the target audience of the game where it's like, is this a game built for the most competitive players? Well, then why is there so much randomness? They're not going to like that. But it's almost like eating your vegetables a little bit. Like, it should be there to make the game unsolvable, to keep the game playable for a long time, to keep you know, buckets of players being able to play against each other. Like, you end up in this weird space where you're like, well, who was this game made for?
I think it's interesting for a game to test the waters of what is the level of variance that casual players will accept and competitive players will accept, because it seems to be, for the most part, accepted by people in the Magic community, but there's a lot of people that don't like the level of variance in Magic and its likelihood of, you know, drawing any one card or drawing mana. So a lot of players end up going to play something like Flesh and Blood, that they talk about having still variance, but being more consistent than something like Magic.
I think what's interesting about it is that there's a bit of a balancing act between the advantages of being able to redeploy your hero and then being able to invest in heroes that are already deployed, which is the gold, right? So, so I think this should be something that's a little bit telling even to the heuristics of Artifact, is that why am I being rewarded for doing this action?
Yeah.
Because you're right, it's a snowball effect. And if you're looking at it from a game design perspective, you're saying, okay, well, the person who is like getting ahead and winning, it will continue to win more.
Right.
But we're not accounting for the fact that your opponent now gets to
redeploy it.
And there's different lanes, right?
Right.
So if you were fighting over the same lane, the snowball effect would be, okay, I'm just behind and there's nothing I can do about it now.
Yeah.
But because there's two other lanes, you can be like, okay, well, I didn't win that engagement. I'm going to move elsewhere.
Right. So I wonder if they just maybe considered that that's like enough of a counteraction.
Right.
To that.
And the value of having your hero killed is much greater than what it is, than what you would think it is at first.
Right.
At first, when you first
so
see
much so that I've played games that I had someone at bay in one lane and didn't want to kill their things because I knew that they had two heroes there.
They're locked in.
And they're locked in.
Yeah.
And so I deliberately did not kill them in that lane in order to make sure that they couldn't
They've sort of overextended in that lane. I'm going to try to keep them there while I focus on the other two,
which,
etc. Yeah.
In all fairness, it's a neat heuristic. It's a cool skill to start to understand. Very unintuitive.
Right.
Very unintuitive as a player.
Right. And you know, I think a lot of this, the skill ceiling in this game is
so high.
So high.
Yeah.
Like insanely high. Like you're playing 3 games at once, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, like, okay, if your audience is the top tier competitive card game players, then yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But you need people to watch that.
Right.
You need people to want to aspire to be that, to get over the hurdle of playing the game at all.
There's a reason that Mark Rosewater talks about kitchen table magic being so important.
Yeah.
That kitchen table magic, you know, supposedly is the most played version of Magic. Is just casual people sitting around playing with their friends and family with whatever cards they got. and Artifact doesn't really have that level of approachability and accessibility, right? It's riding this line of, you want to have a lot of people that play this thing and are very competitive, and like, it's understandable, but there's plenty of people that play League but don't actually care about becoming world champions of playing League or playing Dota or any of those games. They might still play and play ranked or whatever for fun, but they're just happy being like gold, or I don't know their ranking system. I'm assuming they have a gold, but whatever it is.
One thing that's kind of interesting too about tournament play, at least this sort of philosophy that I have about it, is that tournaments are stories just like games are, and that you have a hero and a villain that emerge from this tournament competitive play, in that the decks themselves take on those roles.
Yeah,
and that in Artifact, with the deck archetypes not sort of being loosey-goosey and not very clearly defined, I don't know if you end up in that space. Like, maybe
there was probably some at the time. There's people that were talking about different archetypes, and they were like, oh yeah, like blue is really strong or black is really strong. Or,
but it almost has its own language to learn in terms of that stuff, right? Where you have this built-in knowledge of these archetypes from previous card games, but our Artifact sort of has its own meaning of those things, its own language to learn, and its own understanding, so that you really aren't. And I think that would be really sticky to someone. Like, if you really got over the hurdle and into it and started to learn that language, you would stay there. But getting people over that hurdle is really like that. I think is probably the biggest tragedy.
It's such a large
Artifact.
hurdle, though, that it's so interesting, and I think you're right that it's very sticky, because I've played some games like that in the past, and it's very interesting. It makes deck construction way more exciting, because it feels like okay, for instance, we tried Lorcana. Like, the minute we tried Lorcana, we were like, okay, well, this is so similar to Magic.
Yeah, you just do
that,
the same
like,
stuff.
what's the aggro deck? Right. And you can kind of construct that again.
Right. Why wouldn't I just keep playing Magic? Because this game plays basically the same, except I'm counting to 20 instead of down to 0.
Unless you prefer the systems of Lorcana, it's basically the same. It's a lot of the same interactions with the game. But when you find a game that's more unique in that way, like, I think Flesh and Blood is pretty, I haven't played enough of it, but it's definitely unique as far as a system compared to Magic, that suddenly the way you have to think about a deck is much, much different. And I think it's really exciting from a player perspective to create decks that way when you're a new player to that type of a card game. But I think that what it does, I mean, what the actual reaction was of this is it alienated card game players, right? So you have Dota players that aren't comfortable with a card game, and then you have card game players that aren't comfortable with this type of card game and aren't familiar enough with it.
So where are your players coming from?
Right.
Are they coming from other card games? Are they coming from Dota, where, like, I assume Dota doesn't have this much RNG?
No,
I don't know. I haven't played
think it
Dota
does.
enough. But like, are they going to feel like their skill is being rewarded in the way that they want it to? They're used to playing competitive Dota. Okay, well, if they're coming from a card game perspective and they show up to Artifact and none of their card game knowledge works either,
right?
Where are you getting players from?
Yeah,
there's actually an industrial designer. I forget what his name is. I'll try to look it up, and if I can find it, I'll put it on the screen. But he basically says that the way that you design products for people is that you find what is familiar to them, and then you take them one step further. And Artifact, I feel like, takes kind of what's familiar and then takes a big giant leap 10 steps in the other direction.
What's funny is I actually don't think it took that many leaps forward. I think it's the leaps that it took forward plus the complicated nature of a lot of the systems.
If I was to evaluate Artifact as a game that I had made, I would feel like the trap that I fell into was that I tried to take pieces that I knew to be something that makes a game compelling and be something that makes a game endlessly competitive, unsolvable, right? I would feel like I had taken pieces that I thought when put together would work, but when they're actually put together, it doesn't work. It just sort of ends up as this milieu of game design that doesn't come out into anything particularly cohesive and is not approachable. And that it doesn't have a clear vision in terms of player communication, and I think that when you wrap it in a MOBA, you feel like things are justified, but that I think obfuscates what the big problem actually is, which is that there's not enough for players to hold on to, enough to really wrap their heads around what's going on here as an audience member or as a player. As an experienced player, you can get there. But before you get to that point, I think that it's just it's like walking around in the dark, in the fog, like, where am I?
I think even a big part of that too is, so for instance, one thing I mean, obviously everyone compared this to Hearthstone. I don't want to compare it as a competitor necessarily to Hearthstone, because I think they're very two different audiences. However, Hearthstone is also a game that was based off of Warcraft as an IP, turned into a card game. And so looking at Dota converted into Artifact, what I find really interesting is that you do not need any understanding of Warcraft to play Hearthstone, and that there's many people.
It's really just
that
the
play
setting.
It's the
more
setting,
than anything.
right?
The characters and setting. More
you'll
than
get
the
inside jokes. You'll get the voice lines, but otherwise, I mean, you don't need to know anything else really about Warcraft in order to be able to play that game. You technically don't need to know anything about Dota in order to play Artifact, but when I first read Fountain on a card, I was like, what the hell does that mean? When I first saw that hero deployment was staggered by a turn, I was like, why? Where is that? Where are they? What is this? And I couldn't even find it at first.
They just showed up again?
They just showed up?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess.
Why am I earning gold and buying things in a shop?
Right.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is something that, like, early on in the development of this is also a little confusing, because we've kind of, in our research, we've seen different responses. So whether or not Richard Garfield came to Valve with this game idea, or whether Valve decided like they wanted to make a card game and then decided to base it off of Dota, I'm not entirely sure where it originated from. But what I think is really interesting is that we see this a lot, actually, of people that try to make a game based off of like a MOBA, right? And I don't necessarily think that is an incorrect path, in my opinion. However, I think that when you already have the successful MOBA of Dota, right, and you want to attract Dota players to play your card game that is supposed to emulate the feeling of playing Dota, why would the Dota players not just keep playing Dota?
Right, yeah.
So, I don't think that you need to base the, like, I think Dota as an IP is fine. I'm not familiar with the lore, but I know they have a lot of it available. But, like, it doesn't mean that you had to create a one-to-one to Dota. And I think that what it actually ended up doing is just alienating more people. And that Hearthstone was simple enough for people to understand, because you didn't actually need to know anything about the IP. Yeah. But as Artifact, I think the people that play Dota maybe appreciate it more, because they can understand. They're like, oh, it's 3 lanes. There's my heroes. Oh, this is really cool. Whatever. It's like Dota. But other people are going to be like, I don't understand any of this. I don't know what's going on.
Right. And one of the reasons why you use, like, why flavor and theme is so important in game design is that it does allow you to lean on players' internalized knowledge to say, oh, well, this thing has flying. It flies over your guys. That makes perfect sense.
Right.
Where if you don't have internalized knowledge about MOBAs here, you're going to be alienated by what's happening.
It's unfortunate, because I think that there's a lot that the game does very well. I personally just really like that they did something different. If you can say anything about Richard's designs, is that he never really makes the same game twice, and I appreciate that. I'm not the biggest fan of Keyforge. It's not something I play a whole lot of, but I played it and was like, yeah, this is like, it's different. It's cool. Like, I see it for what it is, and I think that's really great.
Right. And I think so often game designers see games as a science, right?
Yep.
In that you look at a game that's been made as almost like a research project or something, and you see the solution that they came to, and you go, oh, I like the solution, but there's a few things about it that I don't like. So I'm going to take that solution, I'm going to get rid of things I don't like, and I'm just going to plug it into my game, and then I'll continue to build on the sort of research projects that have come before.
Yeah.
And the problem is that it doesn't like include the context of that system working previously.
Yeah.
And you are also then just creating the same experience again, right? So science has this strive for consensus, right? You're trying to find the truth in something. And art doesn't have that. Art is subjective. Art is novel, and giving, a player wants a new experience. They want something they haven't felt before. And if you're striving for solving games, you are missing the entire point of creating a novel experience for someone.
It's kind of wild how many people, I think, go into it thinking these other companies don't know what they're doing. I'm going to solve it. I'm going to make the game. I'm going to make the best trading card game ever. And I think that that's the wrong way of solving it. I don't think it's about making the best trading card game ever, right? That's like saying you're going to make the best FPS. But some people like Overwatch and some people like Call of Duty. And those are both FPSs.
And they're both valid
experiences. And so I think it's not about trying to just make generally the best thing ever. It's about trying to, I think there's usually two ways that you can handle things. I think take it as you trying to solve a problem. That's more of a crunchy, mechanical, systems-driven game design approach, or it's about you trying to fulfill an experience.
Yep.
And that is more flavorful, that's more narrative, more artistic. And I think if you take either of those approaches, it's a good way of helping you find a vision and guiding you with the direction of your game.
Yeah, and I think here at the end of the video series, I think that the lesson that I would take from Artifact's design choices is to take risks. It's that they're not always going to pay off, but if you don't take risks, what are you even doing?